Hello everyone, this is Ben, and in this video what we're going to do is talk about responding to or answering objections to the moral argument for God's existence. So the argument for God's existence from morality tends to be maybe the best argument to share if you've only going to get to share one argument. Although I've found situations where a different one will click for somebody a little better. In general, the moral argument's the best one because, for one, it flows directly into a question of the gospel of Jesus Christ, because as soon as you have a moral lawgiver, then you've got a moral law, and then people have to ask themselves, how does God judge me? Am I a sinner? Can I really, go to heaven just based on my own righteousness? And then it leads directly into, Christianity and that sort of thing. Now, and it tends to be one that people get and understand. Even people who tell you that they don't like arguments for God's existence and they think that that's icky and shouldn't be brought into the church, they've heard this argument before, in my experience, and they have some sort of objection to it. It's one of those weird things. The problem is that not that no one's ever heard it, but they haven't heard it enough, or that there hasn't been discussion about it. So one of those strangest, maybe not strange, but one of, I guess, more interesting things is, as I've shared this argument over the years and, been working, as a volunteer in ministry as much as I can, I've gotten a lot of pushback on this argument, and by far, most of the pushback I've gotten has come from females. It comes from girls. It comes from women. Teenage girls, young girls, not really older women who have had kids and stuff. So maybe there's something that women figure out as they get older, but I've had a lot of pushback. Not so much pushback on this argument from teenage boys and young boys. Now, I've gotten pushback from young boys and men. They especially tend to perk up when you talk about historical evidence, and stuff like that. And the issue with historical evidence is it's actually really difficult, and the moral argument is way easier to explain. So I'm not that good at explaining historical evidence and that sort of thing. But I don't know what it is. I'm a little bit suspicious that teenage boys and 20-something boys don't understand the moral argument. They kind of don't get it. And so that's why they don't object to it, whereas teenage girls tend to. Most of the objections I've gotten have come from girls, from females, young ladies, whatever you want to call them. So what I want to do is kind of list different objections. Now, if you look at the world of the internet, then you're dealing with internet atheists. In my experience, are generally males. And they, of course, object to the moral argument. But in my personal real-life experience, especially doing ministry in church environments, it's females who object to the moral argument. Even in some cases, actual, ordained ministers. So, let's see. Let's just go through them as best we can. One of the objections I got was really not an objection to the moral argument, but kind of an objection to all arguments. And with this girl, I wasn't sure. Well, let's just call them all women, because it's confusing. Some are older, some are younger. With this woman, she came from a church environment that was where she had been taught 19th century German fideism, and as best I could gather, that was her objection to this argument. She thought this argument was bad, not because it was actually bad, but because she had been taught in church that you can't prove God exists. No justification, no reasoning, no proof for that, no evidence, just told that by people that she looked to and respects. And I'm having to guess here, with this woman, like where she was coming from with that. As best I could tell, as best I could pick up, that was her issue. And what I found is that everyone has, when it comes to an argument, like the moral argument, for an example, everyone has their pet issue. And if you respond to their pet issue, then you prove the whole argument. You prove the whole shamir. Even though you didn't really prove it sometimes. So it's like 19th century German fideism is the idea that, like, you can't prove God exists, you can't prove Jesus came back from the dead, you can't prove any of that stuff. You have to just believe it without proof, and the only way you're really a Christian is if you believe it without proof. And if I defeat that, that doesn't prove the moral argument, that doesn't prove God exists. But for someone who is like fully into that German fideism thing, it might prove it for that person. And what I found over and over again is people have pet objections that aren't really good objections, but it's their objection. And if you want to convince someone that this is a good argument, you have to deal with their pet objection. So with this girl, it was like, as best I could tell, that was her objection. Because like there was no other reason that she was coming at me with other than that. And that was really an objection to all arguments for God's existence. And of course it's a bad objection. I mean, like, if I have proven God's existence with a cold, hard, logical argument, then it doesn't matter what your preacher said, what your parents said, what your Sunday school teacher said, what anyone said. They're just wrong, you know, like. But if they say that you have to believe in God without proof, and then I give you cold, hard, logical proof, then there is proof. It just exists, you know. So that really, you know, just doesn't matter. But that's just an example. I'm just trying to kind of go through dealing with objections. I had another girl with another bad objection to the moral argument, and in her case, I mean, obviously if the objections fail, they're bad, but some of them they're almost irrelevant. Her thing was, she said atheists can be good people too, so therefore the moral argument is not a good argument, you know. And the response to that is like, the moral argument for God's existence essentially says that objective moral laws, or specifically moral values and duties, exist if and only if God exists. Objective moral values and duties exist, therefore God exists. Okay, and then you justify those points. But those first 2 points, if they're true, the premise, the conclusion has to be true. So when she says that atheists can be good people too, what I pointed out to her was that is exactly what the second premise says. The second premise essentially is that there are objective moral laws that really exist, and everybody knows they exist. You have to know they exist to, you know, that. So like atheists know right from wrong. That is a foundational cornerstone of this argument. This isn't an objection. That is literally what I'm claiming. Okay, so for her it was like, oh, well that you know, then she was completely convinced, you know, the way she explained herself to me. At that point, she was done. Like, oh, okay, I believe. I'm convinced by the argument. It was like, that doesn't prove the argument, but for her, that was her thing, you know. I had another girl at another time, and I went through the argument, went through the spiel as best I could, you know, in the time frame that I had, and she was like, okay, I get it. And she was with me and responding and dialoguing, and it was like, she got it. And then she was just, okay, this is a good argument, and I'm good. And like, it was just like, game, set, match, game over. She's convinced, and that was that. You know, and she was just happy to move on. You know, we proved God's existence. You know, and that was all she needed. And you know, it's interesting to see how one person it'll just click for them, and the other person they have some objection. I had another girl who was like, I don't know, she had just graduated high school, and like, she gave one of the weirdest responses. She said, there are people who disagree with you. And it was like, I hate to say it, but maybe the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Like, I don't know, I guess I've heard dumber things. But like think about what you're saying, you know? Like, I wouldn't be making a case for you. I wouldn't be presenting an argument. I wouldn't be proving a point if when I do that, I am going into that with the presumption that there are people who don't agree with the point I'm making That's why I gave the proof in the first place. So, what are you talking about? That's literally why I'm making the argument. Because there are people who disagree with me, and I want to point out that they are wrong. So like, I don't know, like, there's ways you can take what she's saying, but like, one of the problems I had with some of these girls is like, and to some degree guys too, is, well, to a large degree, is they disagree with you, but they don't want you to know that they disagree with you, but it'll sometimes come up. And it's very difficult to prove your argument to someone who won't communicate with you, because they have a pet objection that for them defeats everything you're saying. And there's so many different pet objections that it's hard for me to just give a talk, give a lesson, or post a video or write a blog, or share something. It's very difficult for me to do that. There's a very good chance I'll miss your pet objection, which is probably very easily refuted. But I don't know what it is, and I'm not going to waste my time with it because I've never heard it before, and it's very idiosyncratic. It's unique to you. It's your little thingy, It's something that comes from your neck of the woods, and so that's kind of what this video, I'm trying to just list them all. And I know there's someone out there that's like got some other one that I'm not going to respond to. And like, what am I supposed to do about that? I just do the best that I can. And I can go through the argument in sort of a hard-nosed way that makes it very difficult to get around. I've had some pushback from males. I don't want to say that I haven't, but as I think through the objections that I've heard, I keep remembering very brief interchanges with girls who I wasn't able to really hash it out with them. And so it's unlikely that I was able to really do as much good as I could have if we could have just had a longer than 10-minute conversation. Now, I had another girl, or maybe young lady, she was like 20 or something, and like, her objection was this. She said, morality comes from evolution. Now, when it comes to that objection, that can be a more hard-nosed objection that you need to take very seriously and deal with. But a lot of the time, you don't have to take it as seriously as that to convince her or him, whoever it happens to be. So, with that objection, a short answer, a brief answer, a quickie answer to that objection might be something like this. Okay. Let's say that human evolution had followed a path more similar to alligators. Male alligators eat their offspring, which ensures that only the weakest and the slowest and the more deformed ones don't survive, and it helps make for healthier alligators, so it's an evolutionary benefit. So like, the slow ones get eaten by the male alligators, and the weaker ones get away. If our evolutionary path as Homo sapiens had followed something more similar to alligators, then we would think that it is morally okay to eat the babies as long as they're the weaker ones. Okay, so do you think that that's okay? So a lot of the time with the moral argument, you can kind of bypass a lot of discussion, a lot of talk by just saying, are you really willing to say that, there is no moral law, that morality is completely a made-up thing, or, that it evolved, or something like that? Because if you go with something like that, then you have to say that, like, what I can do is I can give you some example, like eating babies, and say, under your view, there is nothing morally wrong with eating babies. Are you prepared to admit that and agree with that? Because that is what you're saying. You just don't want to take it to its logical conclusion here. And it's like, okay. Most of the time, that is the better way to deal with the objection, instead of having to, like, go too far with it. You know, you can give a different example, like, you know, if our, here's William Lane Craig says like this: if our evolution had followed a path more similar to bees, then fertile females would kill each other because there can only be one queen bee, you know, and they would all kill each other. Because whenever there's more than one fertile female in the hive, they fight to the death, and the survivor gets to have all the babies. Okay. So yeah. Let's see. Another objection. I had another girl, younger, much younger. I think she was 15, and her objection was like this, and it was a weird situation where apparently she was an atheist, but like it was something that like I couldn't know about, someone else had to know about, and then that other person had to come to me and ask me for proof for God's existence, and so then I had to give that person the 10-minute apologetics course, and I gave the moral argument, and you tried to write it down on a sheet of paper, give it to that person to go back with, because everyone's afraid to talk to me, which is very frustrating. Okay, because this is they make it so difficult. Like, you're handicapped. It's like I have to go into the debate with like both hands tied behind my back and like two ravenous lions tied to my legs, you know, that I've got to fight off while debating you, whereas you get to come out in a comfortable chair, you know, like you know what I mean? Like, I'm not allowed to like be on an even setting here. You won't look me down and stare me face to face, like, you know. And so this was this weird situation. It's like through proxy, you know. Well, anyway, I don't know exactly what happened, but I think all of that was discussed on some level behind the scenes, and then I got a response from the girl that, like, I didn't realize at first that it was even a response. You know, we're just in a conversation as a, you know, group, everyone's there, and we're just making small talk, and she just, like, all of a sudden throws it out there that, like, this is what she said. People in the past used to have one idea of morality, like, for example, they thought slavery was okay. But today people think that slavery is not okay. So therefore morality is just made up by people. And that was her response to this argument. And I didn't even get a chance to like go into it, you know, like in that environment. It's very difficult, you know, like I'm not allowed to like so like very annoying, you know, that like I don't get to respond because I'm not allowed, you know, but she gets to throw that out there and I don't see it coming and it's coded, and like I didn't realize that like she was even responding on the moral argument. It's just all of a sudden like out of the blue, and you know, someone doesn't want to clearly make it clear that we're going to have to talk about this, you know. That is some of the most difficult Christian apologetics there is to do with people who love to hide, you know. It's like I have to go into a wrestling match against 30 people, and you know, I've got to have both hands tied behind my back, you know. I don't get a chance to speak. I don't get a chance to say my piece, you know. Well, anyway, a simple response for her is, or for anyone who thinks like that, I've heard other girls, teenage girls, say the exact same thing in a totally different environment. They were from a different town miles away. They said the same thing. In their case, they were like taught to say that by an older woman who like taught them that so that they would know what to say to me. So they had to be prepped, you know, that kind of thing, which made it more annoying. But anyway, I'll put it this way. Here's a simple response to that. In 2000 BC, everyone thought the earth was flat, and that there was a bronze dome that held water back, and the sun was like a lamp that moved across the dome, and then it went down into the ocean that the earth floats on, and went down through the water that's under the ground, and came back out the other side, and it's flat. Okay. That is a flat earth theory, but it's not, at one point in time it wasn't so much a theory, it's just what everyone thought, you know. In 2000 BC, that's what everyone thought. Well, fast forward to today, in 2000 AD, no one thinks that, or 2020 AD, no one thinks that. Everyone thinks it's round. So people disagreed on the shape of the earth. People have disagreed. Different people at different times have thought different things about what shape the earth is. So therefore, does this mean that they're just making it up? Of course not. They have ways of knowing who's right and who's wrong. And even, in fact, even those people back then, the model they came up with was a good model given what information they had access to. It wasn't just made up. They weren't just making it up. I mean, they thought that there was water up in the sky, up above the sky, because sometimes water fell down. And given what they knew about water, that was the best, example they could come up with. And more importantly, what this 15-year-old girl and other girls were saying to me was that the entire category of morality is made up. That there is no such thing as morality at all. Not just that people are making up answers to the question of what is right and wrong, but morality itself, there is no category of morality because people have different answers. That's like saying that people in the past thought the earth was flat and people today think it's round, so therefore there's no such thing as a shape of the earth. The whole thing is made up. Okay? That's a really flawed way of looking at it. Okay, hopefully I've made that clear. Another issue that arises is oftentimes people will come at you, and I remember one time I had some other teenage girls, they come at you with, it was the same ones who were making the same point as the 15-year-old girls. They made this other point that, like, morality is, they would bring up examples of moral situations where it wasn't clear what was good and what was evil. And so that for them, that functioned as proof positive that there is no moral law, because there are situations where we don't know what the right thing to do is, where it's unclear. And so the flaw in that reasoning is, I'll put it to you this way. If I use my eyeballs, I can see the door to the room that I'm in. I use my sense of sight, and I can see the door. But if I look at a very distant object, like the moon, I can't look with my eyes and tell that if that go-kart that the astronauts took to the moon is still up there, or if those flags at those different bases are still up there. I can't tell. My ability to see with my eyes has limitations. But if there were American flags, full-size American flags on my door, or a go-kart on my door, like the ones on the moon, I could easily confirm that they are there. So, in other words, like, our sense of sight is not completely flawless. Like, there are limitations to what you can know through your sense of sight. There are things you can see and there are things you can't see. But just because there are situations that you can't see into with your sense of sight, it doesn't mean that you have no sense of sight. So that's a bad objection, In other words, just because there are moral situations that are difficult for us to see into, it doesn't mean that there are no moral situations that we can see into. So, for example, you can talk about, for example, the insanity defense. Is it really right for someone who's, like, say, a serial killer to get off from punishment by saying that, like, oh, well, he's insane, and so therefore he doesn't get the death penalty or life in prison, he goes to an insane asylum. If they can cure him, then he's set out. That's more of a hazy moral question, Or, for example, do you really think capital punishment is okay or not, or should people just get life in prison? That's a more difficult moral question. But on the flip side, like, there are moral questions that are more obvious, like, do you think that it's always okay to steal? Yes or no? I think most people could obviously say, no, it's not always okay to steal. It may be difficult to say in which situations it is okay and which situations it isn't okay, but to say that it's always okay is obviously we can know something about the morality of stealing, that it's definitely wrong to say that it's always okay. Okay. That's just an example I can give you. If we could give you different examples, and one of the easiest things you can do, people have different moral values or things that fire them up. So for example, people who lean right politically tend to differ from people who lean left in what upsets them. It's not so much their beliefs, but it's more like the things that upset them. So left-leaning people have a psychological profile where they get really upset about the forgotten other way out there that's completely forgotten and abandoned. So they get upset about, the wombats in Madagascar not having, not being treated well by the deforestation in Madagascar. That's what they want to devote all their time to, solving the problems of Madagascar wombats. That's an exaggerated example, but that hopefully makes the point. Whereas a conservative person gets more upset about my family, my situation, us, ours. They don't want anything bad to happen to their people. Okay. Whereas someone who swings libertarian like me, I tend to get more upset just when there's an infringement on freedom. It's like, I don't care what happens to anyone. Just don't tell anyone what to do. It's kind of more what upsets me. It's not so much what I agree with or think makes sense, but it's just what riles me up. I don't like being told what to do. I don't like anyone anywhere ever being told what to do. Just upsets me. It gets me irked. So the point is, you can look at that and so for example, if someone's left leaning, and especially young people, have been kind of indoctrinated in their schools. This is an example William Lane Craig makes. They've been indoctrinated in their schools to, be really concerned about the difficulties that homosexuals face in America. So that's a simple example. You can bring up the Nazis and say, did you know that the Nazis killed hundreds of thousands of homosexuals? I don't know, they killed 6 million Jews, and then they killed 6 million other on top of that, which included rounding up as many homosexuals as they could find and killing them, exterminating them from the earth. Do you think that that's, really, truly, objectively wrong? A lot of young people are going to say, yeah, that was just wrong. You can give a different example. If you're dealing with girls, you could say, okay, in India, the Hindu practice of sati was done away with by the British Empire, where a woman, if she really loved her husband, then when he died, she had to climb into the fire and die with him. And if she wouldn't do that, then she wasn't a good wife, and she didn't really love her husband. And no one would ever talk to her or ever be her friend ever again, and she would be considered a cursed woman. And people thought that if she looked at you, it would bring bad luck on you, and they wouldn't let their children ever be in her presence. Okay? So do you think that that was an evil practice? Especially given that they had arranged marriages, and that oftentimes the husband was much older, much older than, 20, 30 years-ish older than his wife. Should she really, have to die because this old guy who she was forced to marry also died? Do you really think that that's just... Do you think that that is objectively evil, no matter what anyone thinks? Okay? Alright. Well, the moral argument works like this. It's like there are objective moral values, that some things are just objectively evil. We can't know all of morality, but we know something. Okay? And then the other point is that, those objective moral values can't really be real unless God exists. Now, me personally, I had my own objection to the moral argument. I didn't understand, for a long time I didn't agree with it. And so I'm not a girl. I'm not an atheist, I wasn't an atheist then. I wasn't buying into 19th century German fideism. I mean, I hated that, but like I just didn't agree with the moral argument. And my issue was I didn't understand why moral values had to come from God. Why couldn't they just be, why couldn't it just be the way things are, that it is just good to do this and bad to do that? Why do you have to have God to have that? Why can't you just have moral values without God? Not can you be good without God, but why couldn't it just be that there are moral values? That do they exist or do they not exist, or are they just the way things are without God? I didn't understand that. And that is really what the first premise of the moral argument is that we can't have moral values without God. And a way to understand that is to ask yourself this: what is morality? What are moral laws? What are laws of right and wrong? Rules of good and evil? That it's bad to do this and good to do that. What are they if not desires about the way the world should be or ought to be? And if you think about it, you begin to realize that's exactly what they are. It's really, once you understand what morals are, ultimately they are by definition something that must come from a person, a being, And so this is a basic point. This is what David Hume made the point of the is-ought distinction, that there is a difference between statements about the way the world is and statements about the way the world should be. And statements about the way the world should be have to come from a person, because ultimately they represent desires, wishes, goals. And so how is it possible to have values and duties, moral values and duties, without someone doing the valuing, without someone prescribing the duty, that sort of thing? Because at the end of the day, what are they if not desires about the way the world ought to be? So, for me, that it started to make sense once I understood that, and then once I understood that there would have to be an ultimate moral lawgiver, then the argument kind of clicked for me that it would have to be God. Now, let's take a detour into what you find with internet atheists. So internet atheists are a bit different. They have their own hang-ups, and it's always the same ones. One of the most common ones is that they fail to recognize the difference between moral epistemology and moral ontology. In other words, they fail to recognize that just because we don't need God to understand and know morality, it doesn't mean that we don't need God for there to be such a thing as morality for us to come to find. So in other words, we don't have to have God necessarily to go and find something, but for that thing to exist at all, you do have to have God. So that's really the point. They fail on that point a lot. The basic distinction between ontology and epistemology. We're not asking how do we know the difference between right and wrong. We're asking, why is there such a thing as right and wrong, as a good or evil way in which to behave? So what they'll do is they'll look at a situation killing is bad, but is it always bad to kill? And then we can start philosophizing and reasoning and say okay, what if you've been, this is the classic Augustine's philosophical point. He's a Christian, by the way. What if you've been put in charge of babysitting a 6-year-old girl, and then someone comes in and is going to kill her, and the only way you can stop that guy is with deadly force? And then, the atheist would say, we're using philosophy to get our morality. We don't need God for that, because we're reasoning about it, and, we're reasoning that killing would be justified in that situation, but not in other situations. And what they're failing to understand is that doesn't explain why there is such a thing as morality. Why is there such a thing as good or evil at all? Is really the basic question. Why is there such a thing as good or evil? And if they can retreat to some other point, but it's going to be some other point that we probably covered, you know. But they'll probably have to drop that point at that point. Another issue you run into with atheists is they try to have their cake and eat it too. With internet atheists or people who are openly atheists, they'll try to have their cake and eat it too. So like they'll believe in objective morality until it causes a problem. So it's sort of a taxi cab fallacy where, you know, you want to ride objective morality all through town until it gets to where you want to go, and then you just get out of it like it's a taxi cab, and then you can just go about your merry way. So like they want to say that slavery is objectively wrong, and these people who engage in slavery or engage in rape or, you know, these moral atrocities around the world, they're so horrible, they're so horrible, they're so horrible, that's evil, and they want to condemn it in the strongest moral tones with a strong stance of objective morality. But then when we say, well, if morality is objective, then there must be an objective moral lawgiver, and therefore God exists, all of a sudden they believe that morality is something that's totally, purely subjective, and people just make it up. That is a taxi cab fallacy. That's a blatant taxi cab fallacy. So it's like they're saying that 1 + 1 makes 2 when you owe me money, but 1 + 1 makes less than 2 when I owe you money. If 1 + 1 makes 2, it always makes 2. And if morality is objective, it's always objective. It's not just objective when it's convenient for you, you know, and then becomes subjective when it's inconvenient for you. If it is what it is. Okay, that's pretty much the most basic statement I can make. You know, I remember I was watching the first Batman Begins movie, and I had a mentally handicapped friend, and Batman and his mom and dad were riding on this train. And it was an elevated train, and he said, "Is that one of those?" And he couldn't think of the word. I think they're called Eltaveds, or they call them L's, or elevated trains. He said, "Is that one of those? One of those?" And then they showed like a big shot of the elevated train. He said, "One of those right there. Is that one of those right there?" And I said, "You asking me, is that right there? That right there?" "Yeah." Then the answer is yes. You know, so if morality is objective, then it is objective. Okay. Is that right there? That right there? Yes. Another issue you might get from atheists is they'll hide under terminology. Atheists like to hide under long words or big words and act like there's, you know, something there when there's nothing there. So they'll say that morality is... you know, that we have this thing called secular humanism, and secular humanism is this big thing, and we have conventions and meetings, and it's a whole system of morality that's like comes from, you know, you don't need God. It's totally secular. It's totally an atheist moral system. Well, secular humanism doesn't answer the moral ontology question. It answers the moral epistemology question. You start with some basic values, and then you begin to reason, and you might even bring scientific knowledge in to help you refine that. But it doesn't answer the question of why there is such a thing as good or evil. Why is any action any better or worse than any other action? That's really the fundamental. And I think probably one of the better things to do, understanding these objections is good because it can make it really handy. But one of the better things to do is just understand the basic concept there. So let's take a look at it. I think it's fairly clear that David Hume's is-ought distinction is a good point. And that's a fairly strong point. And that defends the first premise of the moral argument, that moral values exist if and only if God exists. But then the second premise, do moral values exist? There is a question of like, well, how do you back that up? Okay. A simple way to back that up is to make this point. You are within your rational rights to believe in something that you see. So, this is a classic point from epistemology. Let's say that you are out walking down the road and you see a field. And in that field, you see some sheep, and you see... Well, let's just say you see one sheep in the field. Okay? And you look out there and you see the sheep, you will naturally form the belief that there is a sheep in the field. Why? Because you saw the sheep. Okay? You saw the sheep in the field, therefore you believe that there's a sheep in the field. Are you within your rational rights, or what's called warrant? Is it a warranted belief? In other words, do you have justified reason for holding that belief? Are you within your rational rights, basically, for holding the belief that there is a sheep in the field because you looked out there and you saw a sheep in the field? Yes. If that's not rational, then most of life is not rational. Okay, so you are within your rights, your epistemological rights. You have warrant. It is a justified belief. Is it possible that there is no sheep in the field? Yes, it's possible. So let's say that the farmer comes up, and you know the farmer, and you know that he is a honest man, and he knows his land well and his fields well, and he tells you, you know what, I have a sheepdog that at about this distance looks like a sheep. He doesn't tell you that that's the sheepdog out there, but he just tells you about his sheepdog that at this distance looks like a sheep. What you would have now is an undercutting defeater for your belief. It doesn't disprove your belief. It doesn't prove the antithesis of your belief or the opposite of your belief, but it just undercuts the rational warrant for your belief. So now your beliefs are unwarranted in the presence of this defeater. But in the lack of the presence of said defeater, then your beliefs are warranted. So like, in other words, if I look out there and see the sheepdog, then I'm warranted in holding the belief that see the sheep, then I'm warranted in holding the belief that there's a sheep out there. And this is how people live life all the time. If I walk across the road and I see a car coming towards me, then it is a justified belief for me to believe that there is a car coming towards me. So we have a sense of morality, a moral sense. It's like a sixth sense. We have a sense that some things are wrong. So I can, the easiest way to grapple with this is like with examples. So for example, do you think it's morally wrong to, for example, here's an extreme example, take a baby, cut the baby up, fry them like fried chicken, and eat them? Is that morally wrong? Yes. You have a sense in which that's wrong. In the absence of any good defeater, then you are justified in holding the belief that it is morally wrong. Okay? Now, let's say someone comes to you with a defeater and they say that, like, well, evolution, provides a defeater for that belief. Well, I'm not so sure that evolution is a strong enough defeater yet, because let's go back to our sheepdog example. Let's say that somebody comes to you and he's not the owner of the field. He's some guy that you know to be the town liar. And he says to you that that's not a sheep out there, that's a sheepdog that looks like a sheep. It's not a good defeater if you know that in other words, if the rational warrant from just seeing the sheep out there can be stronger than some defeaters. Okay. Evolution, refuting morality itself in the sense of morality, I don't know about that. Think about it like that. What if someone told you that everything you see with your eyes is defeated by the theory of evolution? I don't know if evolution's that strong, And to defeat the moral sense seems like you're going to need a pretty powerful defeater to defeat that. Now, there are some cases where your rational warrant is so strong that you would need a very big defeater to defeat it. So, for example, let's say that you are accused of slashing one of your coworkers' tires at work during, one day. You come to work on your off day and you slash that guy's tires. And let's say that they bring to the court all kinds of evidence. They've got video of someone that looks an awful lot like you. They've got multiple witnesses who say they saw you do it. There's no good reason why those people would lie. You've got motive. You are well known to hate this person, and you've attacked that person's car in the past. And so a jury would be within their rational warrant for finding you guilty of the crime, given all the evidence, the motive, everything. You don't have an alibi, But let's just say that that you were out mountain climbing the whole day. And you really were out there mountain climbing the whole day. In that situation, your warrant for your belief is so strong that it would overrule the jury. Even though the jury would be in their rational right to convict you, The fact that you were just there mountain climbing and you know you were mountain climbing overrules them. But if the prosecuting attorney brings even more evidence to bear, then maybe you would start to doubt yourself and say, maybe I'm crazy. You know, essentially what you would have to say, what if he has DNA evidence of you, fingerprint evidence that you were there, then you would have to start saying, well, maybe I'm just insane. Okay, so my point is this. In the absence of a good defeater, we are within our rational rights to believe in morality. Just like if you walk out on the road and you see a car, you're within your rational rights to believe that there's a car there. So you have a justified belief that there is such a thing as right and wrong. Okay? Now, for some people, that's enough. I want to push the point further. And the way that I can push the point further, I've talked about this numerous times in other videos. If I want to push the point to a more hard-nosed level where it becomes even more difficult to wiggle around, what I can say is this. Where does the very idea of morality come from? So I don't have to argue that objective moral values exist. I just have to argue that the idea of objective moral values exists. That is clearly true. Because what are we even talking about if we're not talking about objective moral values? And then the question becomes like, where do they come from? Well, they're either thought up by somebody or they originate without a personal being thinking them up. Okay? Those are the only two options. Either somebody thought them up or they originated completely impersonally. In other words, they have a personal origin, somebody thought them up, or nobody thought them up, they just originated somehow, I guess more accidentally or something like that. Or just naturally. So some sort of physical material process that we don't yet understand. Okay? And some people say, that's what some people say about evolution, that it is literally a physical material process that we don't fully understand, but we know a lot about, and that is where our moral values come from. Okay? Now, what a lot of teenagers will say is that morality is subjective and people just made it up. Okay? The problem with people making it up is that why would people do that? In other words, when people first made up morality, why would they do it? In other words, when they made up morality, they made up the idea that there is such a thing as anything being good or bad at all whatsoever. So they wouldn't think that it was good to make up morality. So if they didn't think it was good or bad to do any action ever, then why did they make up the idea that it was good or bad to do any action ever, given that they don't think that it's good to make it up? In other words, did they think it was good to make it up, the idea of being good? This is a fundamental philosophical question. Typically, this question is applied to God. You know, this is a major argument. Why would God make up morality in the first place? And this is a serious objection. It's called the Euthyphro dilemma. In the case of God, you can resolve it, but in the case of people, you can't. And with God, you can resolve it by saying, well, God didn't make it up. But then you have to ask the question, well, what if moral values are higher than God? Then they would be in higher authority than God. Then they would be God's God, and then God's God is the real God. Okay, that is a problem for God. With humans, that's not really a problem because it is a problem for humans to just make up morality when they don't think it's good to do anything. That is a problem, just like it's a problem for God. But with humans, it's okay to say that moral values are higher than God. Okay? And if you think humans make up morality, another problem you run into is like, which human do you go with? You know, Martin Luther King, Hugh Hefner, Mother Teresa, they would all make up different moral systems. So which one of them is right? You know, you'd have to say none of them is right. And then you're back to the question of, well, do you think there's really no objective moral values? But the more fundamental question is like, why would people make it up when they don't think it's good to make up things? They don't think it's better to make it up than to not make it up. Okay? And it is an issue with why would God do that. Now with people, it's like, well, people could have a moral law that's higher than themselves because they're not God. And it's okay for people to like have something higher than themselves. But when you start talking about God, if you say there's something higher than God that has authority over God, the problem becomes, well, then that higher thing is the real God, and the whatever that you've been calling God is not really God. Okay, so in the case of God, the only way around this, because the only way around it is, in other words, where did the idea of morality come from? Again, we're talking about the idea of morality, so it has to come from somewhere. We run into an infinite regress of like always, pushing it back a step. So the buck has to stop somewhere, and the only way the buck can stop is with a God who is the moral values. So in God's case, God can be the moral values. They can be grounded in God's nature. In God's nature, in God's will can be in total unity, so that they're not two separate things. But in humans, it can't work like that, because for a being to be the moral values, in other words, to say that God is love, like 1 John 4 says, would mean that God never does unloving things. So if you were to try to do the same response with humans, then humans would be perfect and never do anything wrong. And of course, like I said, which human? Since humans disagree, it proves that humans can't be the grounding of morality. The fact that humans disagree. Okay. And they can't even be the grounding of where moral values come from. Okay. Now, there is the question of evolved morality, or morality originating through some sort of impersonal process, some sort of physical, material process. So let's say that some sort of process through just physical activity in the universe of electrical energy and whatever, chemical reactions and physical collisions and gravity and all that. Or, maybe we'll have to expand our idea of how physics works and chemistry works and all that, and electromagnetism works. But regardless, whatever that is, if that gave rise to you, and that is what made you, then you are a machine. You are a mechanoid. You are a robot. And it is possible for there to be machines that have been programmed with goals. And so it's imaginable that some sort of crazy physical process could take place that could impersonally, without a desire, without a person, build a machine. It would be unlikely, but it's imaginable that a machine could be built, and that machine, could have goals that it carries out. Okay. If that machine carries out those goals, then essentially it's doing what it was built to do. So you can think of it like the GPS in your car. The GPS in your car is a machine. It's just circuits and computer chips, a lot of transistors that basically are little gates that switch on and off. And it can get really complicated, but it can be programmed with a goal. It's essentially a thinking machine. It's programmed with a goal. It can access data banks of information. It has the ability to communicate with satellites to get its location. It has the ability to access stored information. Your phone can have a GPS that can access online information. And then it can pull all the information together, and it can pursue the fulfillment of the goal that it was built to pursue. Now, GPS computers are built by people, but what we're saying is, what if there are machines that have been built through purely physical processes, and they've been built with goals? Okay? And the question is, what if that's all morality is? What if our belief in that it's good to, love people and bad to hate people, it's good to love your neighbor and it's bad to hate your neighbor or eat your neighbor or something like that. What if that's just something that we just happen to have been programmed with through some sort of physical, biological, chemical, electrochemical process? And we're just machines that just happen to have formed through this long process. then what if that's all morality is? Well, remember the point. The question is, where does the idea of morality come from? The issue is that the idea of morality exists. And the idea of morality is that it is good to make good choices and bad to make bad choices. Right? That is the idea of morality, and that idea exists. Even if it has never existed before I said it, well, I just said it, so therefore it exists. But we all know that it's existed a long time before I said it. Well, machines don't make choices. Machines just do what they are built to do. The GPS does what it is programmed to do. And if you are a machine that has been programmed through some sort of natural, immaterial, physical process, then you just do what you're programmed to do. In other words, machines are always forced to do what they do. They don't make choices. If they did, they wouldn't be machines. Machines don't make choices. They do what they're built to do. They're tools. Okay, they function how they're built. They may malfunction, but that's a problem in how they're built. As the old adage says, with a computer's garbage in, garbage out. If you programmed it wrong, it'll spit out wrong data. If you programmed it right, you built it right, and everything's right, it'll work right. Okay? Gears turn based on how they're built. Okay? If they're built wrong, they'll turn wrong. If they're built right, they'll turn right. Okay? So here's the issue. If you are a machine that has been programmed with an objective of being good, well, being good is really an objective of making good choices. But essentially it's a goal of making good choices. But if you are such a machine, then you have been programmed, but being programmed is really being forced to do something. Because machines only do what they're forced to do based on how they are made. Through whatever made them. That's what they do. And we are machines if we have been made through this physical, material, natural process. If nobody made you, then you're just a machine. You're just a cog in the machine of the universe. If that is the case, then morality is literally a goal of freely choosing to do good things that you have been forced to pursue. And that's impossible. You know, it's like this. If you take a wrong turn, your GPS doesn't care. It just recalculates. The GPS doesn't decide that it would be good for you to go to the destination or bad. It doesn't have a goal of making good choices. It just completes the objective that it was programmed to complete. So if you are such a machine, then morality is a goal that you have been forced to pursue. The problem is that the idea of morality is the goal of freely choosing to be good. That idea exists, but that idea cannot be created in this way, because if it was created in this way, then it must be a goal of freely choosing to be good that you are forced to pursue. But you cannot be forced to freely do something. That is a logical contradiction. That's like 1 + 1 equaling 35. Like, it's just impossible. It's logically impossible. You can't force someone to freely do something. That's the problem. The idea of morality cannot exist unless it comes from a being, because physical material processes cannot create that idea, because if they did, they would force you to pursue it. But it is an idea of freely choosing to be good. So they cannot give a sufficient explanation for where that idea comes from. Therefore, it must come from something else. Therefore, there is no other option. Like we said, either people made it up, either it arose impersonally, or either God made it up. We saw that in the people category, it really has to be God. Well, the impersonal category is literally meaningless. It is literally self-contradictory. It's like I was debating this guy online years ago, and he said that humans don't have the ability to choose to be good or evil. They're born with original sin from Adam in the garden. And I said, a bunch of things to him, but he said he doesn't blame Adam for the bad things that people do, but Adam is the cause of the bad things people do. You see, that doesn't make any sense. Like, if you'd given a gorilla a typewriter, it would have made the same amount of meaningless nonsense. Okay. When you say that you have been forced to freely do something, that's meaningless nonsense. The idea of morality originating that way is meaningless nonsense. Therefore, it didn't originate that way. Therefore, it originated personally. The problem with saying that it originated personally is we run into another meaningless nonsense, because people wouldn't create morality because they can't create morality without thinking that it's good to create morality. Okay? And they can't appeal to a higher morality than themselves, because then they're not creating morality. And in God's case, God can be the moral laws. So the only answer is that God must therefore exist. But most people's objections will be easier to deal with than that. So what we want to do now is try to think of a way around everything that I've said. And so what I'm going to do is suggest for you a way around what I've been saying. And I'm going to kind of assume that you were following me up to this point. If you weren't following me up to this point, just rewind and make sure you got it, because there's really no point in moving any further or going any deeper until you understand, the shallower stuff. There's no point in going into the deep end if you're not comfortable with the shallow end. So anyway, it is thinkable that a moral statement could originate by natural processes, essentially accidentally, unconsciously. So it's possible that there could be, the stars could just so happen to line up in the sky where it says love your neighbor, or like a mountain range could form that way, or I don't know, radiation or a mutation could happen where you just have that idea in your brain. It's possible for that's a statement like love your neighbor, for example, to just arise purely accidentally through some natural physical process, totally without any awareness. This system that originates, it has no awareness that happens. So that's possible. Okay, well, if we are created through said processes, then we would be machines, and we run into that contradiction of machines are forced to do things, and you can't really force someone to have a goal of freely choosing to be good. But what if, just throwing it out there hypothetically, what if we do have free will? Okay. But the idea of good and evil just originated accidentally. Pick your poison on that. Pick whichever, pick your adventure. So let's just say that, I don't know, there was an explosion in a printing shop, and the statement "love your neighbor," the first moral statement, appeared on a piece of paper. And some free will being encountered it. The problem is this free will being would encounter the same Euthyphro dilemma that we talked about back with subjective morality. Because the issue with subjective morality is it's not just the creation of a moral law that can't be created subjectively. It's also the adoption of a moral law. So when a human creates a moral law, the problem is that they don't think it's good or bad to create the idea of good or bad. It's not just that. So even if you wholesale create it, you've got that problem. Or if it's laid at your doorstep, you've still got to decide whether or not to adopt it. So you can think of giving birth to morality, or you can think of just adopting it. Like it's you went to the orphanage, and the sheet of paper with a moral law was laid at your doorstep. you still have the same problem when you have to decide whether or not to adopt the idea of good and evil when you currently don't think there's such a thing as good or evil, when you have no desire for life to be one way versus another way. You don't think any action is any better or any worse than any other action. Then why would you adopt the idea that some actions are better or worse than any other action? So you run into the same problem that you can't really subjectively create morality, like we said before, but you also can't subjectively adopt morality. Okay, so technically we could explain the origin of the idea of morality, but we couldn't explain why anyone would believe in it. So you do run into the same problem. And then, so since it's obvious that people believe in morality, not only that people, that the idea exists, but that people do believe in it, then this isn't really a possible alternative to an absolute moral lawgiver. Now, the only thing you could say is, like, isn't this a problem, like, if God created us, how did we come, and God created us, and God gave us His moral law, then isn't that the same problem? How could we subjectively adopt that? Well, that's not exactly a problem, because if God created us, then God could have created us with some sort of built-in awareness of the goodness of His moral law. And so it could be objectively observed, instead of simply being adopted totally subjectively. So it's not a problem if the objective moral values are really real and we can observe them. And so what this means is the thrust of this argument is that humans must, remember what we've said, the idea of morality cannot be created subjectively. It cannot be adopted subjectively. It cannot be created and built into us like machines through natural processes. It must therefore be, but because of this other thing with the problem with subjective adoption, it means that we must observe it somehow. We must have been created with the ability to observe its reality. And that's the only possibility left to us. So what that means is humans must be able to have some sort of knowledge of right and wrong, of good and bad, and not just good and bad in every way. I mean, it's possible for some people to be more nearsighted than other people. Maybe people who are born psychopaths, might need a pair of glasses, and maybe for them the pair of glasses is the Bible. But like, they still have some moral values and duties. They still have some concept of it. They just have a much more hazy view of it. So like, because we're not just talking about moral duties, we're talking about moral values, and there's a big difference there. Moral values is the idea that, like, there are some things that are good to do, but you don't necessarily have to do. And moral duties are things that are good to do, and they're bad if you don't do them. So like, a moral duty would be don't steal from the store. A moral value would be like become a medical doctor, which is good to do, but you could also open a chain of grocery stores, which is also good to do. You could also be a farmer who supplies the grocery stores, which is also good to do. So like, a moral value is something that's good to do that you don't have to do. And a moral duty is something that you have to do. Alright, so the problem is, like, hopefully I'm making the point clear, without moral values, it's like you don't even think any action that you take is any better or any worse than any other action. Okay. So it is a serious issue. Now, there's one final point I want to address, and that's this. Sometimes you might run into someone, and I've done it before, and I didn't realize that, like, the goose had laid in a golden egg and sat it at my door. I didn't realize it at the time. You might run into something, because it was just an online comment, I think it was a guy, but he said, probably a teenager. In fact, in my experience, teenagers, male and female, they tend to always believe morality is subjective. Not all, but it's very common. well, this guy, he said to me online, he said, morality is subjective by definition. And I didn't realize he was handing me everything I wanted. Like, when he says morality is subjective by definition, what that means is, whether it's a man or a woman, this person gets it. When I was pointing out the issue of David Hume's is-ought distinction, that's really what I was saying. I was saying that morality is really just a set of desires about the way the world should be. In other words, morality is subjective by definition. If you understand that, if you really grip that, then you get the idea that, like, moral values and duties can only come from a person. Therefore, they are subjective by definition. They are really just someone's subjective desires about the way the world ought to be. Okay? In a sense, I mean, not completely subjective, because the problem is that morality also must be objective. And so you run into this quandary of, like, it's impossible for morality to be anything but subjective. And it's also impossible for it to be anything but objective. And I'm not going to go through all of that. We looked at that. But how do you resolve this? I mean, like, how is it possible for morality to be required to be subjective and required to be objective? How can it be both objective and subjective? And a lot of times with young people, they get that. They get that it has to be subjective. They just kind of, they get that people made it up or somebody made it up. Okay? Out of the other side of their mouth, when they're talking about a different subject, they tend to be indoctrinated into belief in objective morality. So, like, this is William Lane Craig's point. He says, like, you can bring up certain the struggles and the evils and the atrocities committed against certain groups of people, and young people tend to have a very strong sense of that was objectively evil. So, like, homosexuals is a good example. Young people tend to just really, they're just kind of trained to be really upset about that. You know, that can be handy. You know, so, like, if I tell you that 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust, sometimes young people are not going to be as upset about that as, you know, if I say, you know, homosexuals died in the Holocaust. But, like, the point is this: out of one side of their mouth, they really strongly get that morality is objective. But out of the other side of the mouth, they tend to have a real strong grasp of the is-ought distinction, which means that morality is really subjective too. And so it's like, okay, how could it be both subjective and objective? The only way it could be is if there is a being whose subjective desires actually define or become the foundation of objective reality, which anyone can tell such a being would have to be God. So anyway, hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for your time.